channeling is sewn down. A few things about this step is that don't get hung up if your stitching is not super straight. You can see here that my stitching here, not perfect. My stitching here, not perfect. What is important is that your stitch lines are wide enough so that you will be able to insert your channeling. If it's not, I would get out your seam ripper and rip it apart. Not rip it apart, but seam rip it apart. Don't actually rip your bodice apart. I also wanted to show a variation. So you have the, I'm using Sage underwire channeling for my boning channels, but let's just say that you don't have channeling to match the fold over elastic that you're putting on, or let's just say you're having trouble matching up the channeling with the rest of the trims. Here is a little variation that I did on another, I'm actually sewing 3 for this tutorial sew along, but for this one, I actually made the boning channels out of the fold over elastic. So this is actually fold over elastic. It's not underwire channeling, but it is a variation that, hey, if you're in a pinch and you cannot find channeling that matches, this is an option. Also, fold over elastic has a shiny appearance, so it gives it a little like chic, high-end look other than the channeling, which is like a matte. So just want to throw that out there. Not going to cover how to do it, but I did want to show you this variation. If you check out Madeline's Instagram as well as YouTube, we do have a tutorial on how to create boning channels out of fold over elastic. Okay, so next step is I'm actually going to use this for the next step, this one. I'm going to use this one for the bodysuit. So for all views, the next step is to attach the shoulder, the front armhole portion. Super easy step, that's why I didn't like demo it. Really easy, but you basically sew the armhole or front armhole to the bodice. The key thing is that you don't want to flip-flop them. When I first pinned it, I was like, wait, hold on, something's not going right here. But it should be a smooth curve from the armhole. If you flip-flop them, you'll immediately notice like something's going on here. So you want to make sure that you have the right to the right, the left to the left, that they're in the correct, on the correct side. Really easy, straight stitch, 1/4 inch seam allowance. Also, the front armhole is going to stop short of the bodice. So you might be thinking like, wait a second, does it go all the way to the end of the bodice? Did I like cut it wrong? No, it should stop short. This next version is just if you're adding the front overlay. So I have cut out my front overlay. This is your front overlay, but since, again, like to show you variations, since it was a stretch or a stretch galloon lace, I cut another one. I was like, wait, I don't actually have to sew on the trim at the bottom because it is a galloon lace. So if you're using a galloon lace, you could do this option as well. Then I did cut out the top portion of it. Off the top of my head, I forget what this piece is called, but I think it's like the upper lace for the front bodice. And I'm going to pin it along here. And then I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning to end, straight stitch. After that, I'm going to sew basting stitches on both of these edges. I'm not going to explain what a basting stitch is, but I will show you how we're going to gather it to put it on the bodice. The lace trim is sewn to the top of the front bodice overlay. I folded the seam allowances to the wrong side and I top stitched them down with a small zigzag stitch. How you treat those seam allowances will depend on what type of fabric that you're using. You might just want to turn it to one side and do an edge stitch with a straight stitch, or you might want to do it as I did with a zigzag stitch. I will leave that up to you. Now you can't see it, but I did sew the gathering stitches on either side. So I'm going to pull on the thread to gather it. Once this is gathered, I will place it on the bodice, and your pattern pieces will have notches on where it should end. So I have marked those with a pin, so I will lay this over. So I have pinned the front bodice overlay to the front bodice. In the instructions, it has you sew the front armhole before you attach the front bodice overlay. You can do either or. The key is that you want the front bodice overlay to basically be going where the front armhole meets the front bodice. Pin it in place. It looks a little kind of like funky right now, and you can adjust the gathers as is, but once I have it all assembled and then I give it like a nice press, I can press those gathers into place. This is not in the instructions, but you can also put it on after everything's assembled and like gather it to where you want it to so it drapes nicely, and then like do a little tack so that it's in the direction, or it hangs exactly as you want it. Okay, so I'm not going to sew this yet. What I'm going to do the next step is I'm going to sew the back to the front at the shoulder seam. Straight stitch, 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitch at beginning and the end. Back is sewn to the front. I didn't serge it. If you have a serger, that is definitely an option, but I didn't. I feel like it gets really bulky, so I pressed the seam allowances towards the front armhole and did a small zigzag stitch. Speaking of seam allowances, I also did not serge the seam allowances for the front armhole. Again, it gets really bulky and these fabrics don't fray, and I actually think that in some cases it's okay to leave the edges raw because it will be bulky and there'll be like lots of threads in a seam. Alrighty, so next step is to attach the sleeve. Now, whenever sewing anything in the rounds, or I like to prevent sewing anything in the rounds. So a lot of beginner sewing classes teach you how to set a sleeve, and that is in the round. I personally think that setting it flat is so much easier. So that is the way that the Buffy is sewn. So what I will do is I will mark the notch at the top of the sleeve cap, and I will align that with the shoulder seam. Making sure that the back sleeve cap is on the back armhole and the front sleeve cap is on the front armhole. It's pointed out on your pattern. And then I will pin backwards and forwards. The sleeves are attached. So just like the shoulder seam, I did not serge the seam allowances just because of the nature of the fabric. I folded the seam allowances to the towards the front armhole and did a small zigzag stitch. This also helps with because the sleeve is sheer, from the seam allowances poking that way or facing that way, and then you will seam it. I went ahead and I attached the fold over elastic at the bottom edge of the sleeve. This sew along is not going to cover how to sew fold over elastic. I'm going to assume that you know how to. If you don't, hop on YouTube. There are loads and loads and loads and tons and tons and tons of tutorials on how to sew fold over elastic. I personally like sewing the fold over elastic at the sleeve opening now rather than sewing the side seam and then trying to sew the fold over elastic in that small hole. One of our sewers actually likes to do it the other way. So if you do like it the other way, you can definitely do it. All right, so the next step, 2 more steps until the top is finished, is that we are gonna sew the side seams. So you are gonna sew it from, full transparency, my battery died at the last step, so I went ahead and did it anyways. Hey, sometimes showing you the after is easier to understand than trying to explain it to you beforehand. So I attached the back to the front. I sewed all along the sleeve seam all the way down. I also went ahead and attached the fold over elastic at the neckline. Again, this sew along is not going to go over how to sew fold over elastic, so it's going to assume that you know how to. Now, before we sew the fold over elastic at the bottom edge, we have one step, is to insert the plastic boning into the channeling. So you want to get it all the way to the top. So you want to get it all the way to the top. And that's why I like to sew the fold over elastic first at one edge and then insert the plastic boning so that you know where it should stop. And then it should stop because you still have to sew the fold over elastic at the bottom edge. So what I like to do is I like to mark where it is and then pull it out just a tad and then cut it. And then push it back in. So once you have once you have inserted the plastic boning into all of the channels, then you will sew the fold over elastic at the bottom edge, and that you will be finished.